Welcome to the Unfettered Speech podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
I'm Leonard Goodman.
Len, good to see you.
Nice to see you too. Today we have the one and only Max Blumenthal, one of the bravest and best investigative journalists in this country. Maybe the most amazing thing about Max. Welcome. Thanks for joining us, Max.
Welcome, Max.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind words, Len.
Maybe the most amazing thing about Max is that he lives in Washington, D.C., lives and works in Washington, D.C., in the belly of the beast, and somehow stays true to his mission of doing true investigative journalism. So maybe we could talk about how he does that later on in the interview. But I'd like to start and talk about Israel-Palestine. Max, you wrote a book in 2014, Goliath. Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. It's an excellent book. I recommend it. It paints a picture of not only what it's like to live under occupation, but also what it's like to live in a state that is an occupying power. And I think I actually started rereading that book recently, and it really foreshadows some of the tragedy that we're seeing right now in Israel, Gaza. So I'd like to start and ask you a little bit about propaganda, because as Jews, we're heavily propagandized in this country. I know I'm speaking for myself, but it's drilled into your head as a young liberal Jew that we have to support the state of Israel, how important it is. We don't talk about 1948. We don't talk about the Nakba. We don't talk about Zionism even. So I'd like to just ask you about your experience as a Jew, your Jewish education. What were you exposed to, and what made you want to live in Israel and experience that culture as you did for the book Goliath?
A lot to unpack, and it's a great question. I definitely didn't want to live there because of any connection that I felt to the Holy Land, or because I thought it would be particularly pleasurable. It was not pleasurable. And it was, in many cases, me living in very, let's say, rustic settings in order to be closer to the ground. Living with, for example, Israeli anarchists, the small community of anti-Zionists there who are there are just several hundred of them who don't have very good outcomes in their lives because they all refused service in the military. And the military is basically your ticket to being considered a Jew at the top of the totem pole in the Israeli social hierarchy under Zionism. But I mean, it gave me insight. I wanted to essentially, when I went into writing this book, Goliath, use my privilege as a Jew inside the militarized frontiers of the so-called Jewish state to be able to tell Americans, not just American Jews, but all Americans, about the real Israel that they were not allowed to know about because of the stranglehold of the Israel lobby over corporate media. And it took me about, 5 years from the inception of the book idea and getting the book deal to its publication in 2013 to be able to do so. And what I showed was one of the most propagandized, indoctrinated societies in human history, masquerading as a liberal democracy, on its way to commit genocide, being primed to commit genocide. And when I was there in the period between 2009 to 2013, that was really the high point of Netanyahu's rule. Israel had just undergone a kind of transitional phase in 2009 where society had done away with the past of labor Zionism. The Zionist left was thrown into the dustbin of history. Netanyahu secured, I saw it. I saw the writing on the wall in 2009. It was clear to me that Netanyahu would be prime minister for as long as he wanted. And during that period, Israel experienced the lowest levels of violence with in its society, the lowest levels of Palestinian resistance after Operation Cast Lead and Pillar of Cloud. So when I was mostly there, things were sort of quiet in Jewish Israeli society, but then once I would go over the wall into the West Bank, you would see it was a constant war on their society. And it shapes the thinking of Jewish Israelis who are in the military that they believe in the Zionist fantasy. The Zionist fantasy is that Israel will be, in the words of Ehud Barak, former Israeli prime minister, defense minister, most decorated soldier in Israeli history, Israel will be a villa in the jungle. It's kind of like what Joseph Borrell said about Europe, but Israel's a villa in the jungle. It's surrounded by refugee camps, hostile populations who are constantly being bombarded and who, in the Israeli mind, are savages. But Israel is facing Europe and it basically enjoys a European level of existence. And the only way that the Zionist fantasy can be punctured is through events like October 7th, Al-Aqsa flood, where they are forced to realize that they have occupied millions of people and they actually can hit back and they exist in a precarious state and that their fearsome military and omnipotent intelligence apparatus is actually not God. But October, and that's why Israel has to commit genocide in Gaza because it's existential. They must commit genocide in order to prevent anyone in Jewish Israeli society from ever hearing from the Palestinians again in order to preserve the Zionist fantasy. That's something that I learned and got to understand on a granular, intimate level, being in Israeli society, living in south of Tel Aviv and Jaffa, living in central Jerusalem, and also being, for example, being able to engage with Israelis on a military base, Israeli soldiers, Israeli border policemen who were in one of the most uh, abusive units while I posed as a human rights counselor, being able to talk to affluent Jewish Israeli women from a group that was essentially criminalized called New Profile, who are attempting to counsel Jewish Israeli youth on how to avoid military service and understand the role of the military in society, going to conferences of state funded Israeli rabbis to defend a manual that was being, or a booklet that was being distributed to Israeli units, Israeli military units, advising them that they have a religious obligation to genocide and seeing those rabbis defend it. Through all of these various chapters of my book, these vignettes I painted, I think I was able to provide Americans and English language audiences with a pretty stark view of a society that it was on its way to carrying out a Holocaust in the name of preserving Jewish sovereignty. And unfortunately, that portrait I painted was confirmed by the reality we're witnessing right now. I mean, it's unfortunate. I wish I were wrong. I wish all the people who attacked me, like Eric Alterman, had been right because so many people would be alive now. But that was the reality that I saw. And, that's what Zionism is.
Max,
Can I
we
ask you a question, Max,
you go
about
ahead, Pat.
that you were saying about being attacked, and we're one of our focuses here is on free speech, and we've seen the spotlight change from certain taboo topics like COVID or election interference, and now it's all about and quote unquote anti-Semitism. Questioning the policies of this Israeli government becomes conflated with anti-Semitism. How has that affected you and your work at all? I assume you're used to being attacked. You've been attacked for many years for many reasons, but has it gotten worse in the last, say, 12 months in terms of the your ability to get your message out, and if so, how?
Well, the whole phenomenon of being attacked or being sort of personally destroyed, reputational assassination, is part of the propaganda model that I think accompanies the model that Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky articulated in The Manufacturing of Consent and Michael Parenti before them. And it's basically a way of managing the narrative without formally criminalizing the dissenter or the messenger of inconvenient truths. And we've seen it happen to so many figures throughout post-war U.S. history, post 1964 U.S. history, especially when the U.S. developed a counterculture. Even comedians were destroyed, like Lenny Bruce. This is something that's very particular, I think, to American society, because unlike Europe, we have a First Amendment. So you can't just formally criminalize someone. What I experienced was, being smeared as an anti-Semite, all of the typical smears being put on lists by race hustler organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation, being denounced again and again by the Anti-Defamation League, all the things you expect. And then having reality match up with the narrative that I was putting forward through my factual reporting. And we're at a point now where the reality is so in your face through social media. Everybody's waking up to images of shredded children, starving crowds, descending on aid sites and getting shot. A Holocaust is unfolding in live streamed fashion. And anyone who had attacked me in the past or criticized me in the past, other than the most extreme adherents of Likudnik and Messianic Zionism, has nothing to say. I mean, they're basically all saying what I said 10 years ago or more. J Street, the liberal Zionist organization that would have considered me a pariah, if not an enemy. Jeremy Ben-Ami, their director, has called what Israel's doing a genocide. David Grossman, the left Zionist Israeli literary icon who I interviewed in my book Goliath, who really did not like me because I was pushing him on the issue of Zionism, and who told me to lose his phone number at the end of the interview, and who argued that Israel needs to be treated with love and with kindness and given lots of aid in order for it to make peace. At that sitting, now accuses Israel of genocide. Avraham Berg, who was the head of the speaker of the Israeli Knesset, and I think was the head of the World Zionist Organization for a period, or one of the major international Zionist bodies. He became a dissenter years ago, wrote a really excellent book I think everyone watching this should read, called The Holocaust is Over, We Must Rise from Its Ashes. And it was originally going to be called Hitler Won. The Israeli publishers refused to allow that. He blurbed my second book, The 51-Day War, my second book on Israel-Palestine. And he is now accusing Israel of genocide and calling for Jews to organize an international boycott of Israel, essentially for Jews to join the BDS movement, which is unprecedented from a figure like him. So when the narrative has gone that far outside the control of Israel's political apparatus, they're going to have to move to away from the propaganda model of just smearing people to actually criminalizing them, to actually arresting them. And they're starting with the green card holders, the Mahmoud Khalils, Ramesa Ozturk from Tufts University, arrested on the street because she wrote an op-ed lightly criticizing Israel for a student paper. They're starting with them. They're cutting funding, $500 million or more of funding for UCLA's Advanced Mathematics Center because they allowed student protests. There's no more propaganda model. The propaganda failed. The argument is over. They have no argument to put forward. It's just the jackboot in your face, the Zionist jackboot in your face for eternity. And it's not just going to be about Israel. Like, I was attacked mercilessly for opposing the COVID lockdowns and the mandates as someone who came out of the left. I was unfriended by people I'd known for years over that. None of them have anything to say anymore because it was obvious that I was kind of onto something and it did enormous social damage. Syria, I was mercilessly attacked and smeared for opposing the regime change operation in Syria. Now we see what's happening under the control of this al-Qaeda government, the mass slaughter of Syrian minorities, Israel being able to advance deep into Syrian territory without the Syrian government firing a single shot. No one has anything to say to me about that. So it's like all of these forbidden narratives in the past have come so close to the reality that we see now that there's no way you can just destroy someone's reputation to shut them up. If anything, we have a bunch of wannabe dissidents now who are looking to say the most extreme thing possible, and overcompensating for their lack of originality with the most extreme theorizing possible, because it's become almost like popular to do, because the establishment has lost all currency and all favor among the public.
Next, you mentioned the liberal, I guess you would call it a liberal Zionist group, J Street. Talk a little bit about the value of that, the positions that they take. I mean, they sort of market themselves as a alternative to AIPAC. They support political candidates, I think mostly Democrats, although you might correct me on that. My experience, I actually went to a J Street conference some years ago. I sort of was sucked into that world a little bit, but then my experience was that when it comes to BDS, they that's sort of a red line for them. And so it seems like they basically, it's a rhetoric group. It's a softer rhetoric, but they don't really want to force or to put any pressure on Israel to get to a two-state solution or some sort of just solution. So what is your opinion of the value of groups like J Street? Do they serve an important purpose in this country?
Yeah, the J Street's role was to just manage the left progressive wing of the Jewish world within the United States, to prevent them from going off the Zionist reservation and to enforce a hard Zionist line within the Democratic Party by channeling liberal Jewish money into Democratic campaigns on the condition that they support military aid to Israel. And then they would make these virtue signaling statements about a two-state solution when Israel was constantly ramping up settlement activity and building settlements, had already built so many settlements under labor governments in the 90s that any Palestinian state would have been impossible. So J Street was really the heart of the problem. And the heart of the problem is Zionism. I mean, you look at a figure like Peter Beinart. He started out with this book, The Crisis of Zionism. And it was simply that Zionism had been overtaken by right-wing elements, but there was some peaceful tradition within Zionism that could have made peace with the Palestinians. And that is really the narrative that needed to be obliterated, because Zionism itself is an ethno-supremacist ideology that requires constant expansion in order to preserve the settler colonial entity and to keep the society dynamic. It is going to have to be militarized because it was planted within a majority Muslim and Christian world that has to be ethnically cleansed. And there's simply no tradition, if you actually look at the history of David Ben-Gurion, the avatar of supposedly socialist Zionism, or Yigal Allon, or Yitzhak Rabin, any of the founding generation of Israel. These were the most blood-soaked war criminals who had no compunction about mass ethnic cleansing. And until recently, they were the ones who had been responsible for the most expulsions and the most wars. So it wasn't even, I don't even think I played any role in this, but Peter Beinart is now certainly a non-Zionist and is supportive of BDS and has been forced to recognize that there is no way that Israel can be at peace unless it is no longer an ethno-supremacist Jewish state, which amounts to its dismantlement. I mean, let's be real. He's joining the rest of us in calling for its dismantlement, there is no more liberal Zionism. There can be no more J Street. J Street has to choose. Either you side with the religious, messianic, fanatical, apocalyptic, and secular fascist leadership of Israel, which is the defining factor of Zionism today, tomorrow, and forever, or you side with humanity and oppose apartheid, oppose an ethno-supremacist political project, and call for the dismantlement of it. Otherwise, there will be no peace. And so this hits on another reason why J Street had to come into existence. It is so anathema within Jewish communal life to say what I just said or to even think it, because once you consider, let's just imagine that the fantasy of a one-state solution actually worked out, and there is a state where it's one person, one vote. Israel, it's Israel Palestine, or Palestine spelled Palestein, to tip of the hat to a nod to its Jewish heritage, and it is at peace. Well, for all of the Jewish boomers who support Israel today, they would have nothing to do because most of them are not that religious. Like Bill Ackman, the Zionist financier and financial con artist in New York, the first time he put tefillin on was after October 7th. He had no religion. They need an embattled Israel for them to feel Jewish. They need organizations to donate to, like United Hatzalah, that rescue people on October 7th, for them to feel like they're doing something for the quote unquote Jewish people. They need to donate to the Jewish National Fund and donate trees, because they're not Orthodox Jews who are going to be davening constantly. They're not even going to shul every Friday night. Maybe they'll show up for the high holidays. And so this is something that gives them an identity. Israel at peace, with Israel at peace, they're just white people in America. Who are they? What is the purpose? And many of them are liberals too. So they need a liberal Zionist group to give them this fantasy that they actually care about peace while they're effectively supporting military aid to a genocidal entity. So J Street fills the void for a lot of people whose identity is in crisis.
Max, you mentioned a two-state solution, and that this is something that liberal Zionists talk about. Now, Jeffrey Sachs still believes, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I mean, he still believes that a two-state solution is the only solution, with a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital on the lines of the 4th of June, 1967, with a security agreement. Is that, do you agree that that is a possibility? What would such a what would Israel look like if it was a state side by side Palestine? I'm assuming it can't be a Jewish supremacist state. I think that's what you're talking about, that a Jewish supremacist state is going to end up in genocide or ethnic cleansing. So could you comment on that?
I mean, as long as there is a so-called or self-proclaimed Jewish state, there will be genocidal activity, there will be ethnic cleansing, there will be settlement activity, and there will be walls everywhere. And it was the concept for the walls came in as supposed preparation for a two-state solution. Oh, we need to draw hard separation, delineate hard separation between us and the Palestinians. Segregation. The two-state solution is based on segregation. And then when the Israelis from the labor side were forced to put forward some kind of two-state solution, they not only refused to offer any final map of borders, they started imposing walls in order to set borders with the major settlement blocks included in what would effectively be a greater Israel, maybe smaller than some in the Likud camp had wanted, but it included all the major settlement blocks, including Male Adumim, whose master plan cuts the West Bank in half. The labor Zionists placed the majority of settlements inside the West Bank. Ehud Barak in the 1990s says he felt a spiritual connection to the settlers. Ehud Barak planted more settlements in the West Bank than Benjamin Netanyahu ever did. Yitzhak Rabin, who campaigned on a promise to get Gaza out of Tel Aviv in order to remove Palestinian workers from Israeli life, conceived the walls that now surround the Gaza Strip and the wall that cuts deep into the West Bank, the apartheid wall. That was his idea. And Yitzhak Rabin, Jeffrey Sachs, I don't know if he knows this or not. I haven't really spoken to him about this. But in his final speech before Knesset, before he was assassinated, because making any deal in Israel is forbidden. He was assassinated after his assassination was incited by Benjamin Netanyahu, his main opponent. Yitzhak Rabin said in his final speech, "We won't give Palestinians a state, we will give them less than a state." And so today, a Palestinian state, in any real sense, is impossible. Gaza is mostly destroyed. Gaza is cut off from the West Bank. The East Jerusalem is cut off from the West Bank, and Israel's fascist messianic government is authorizing more construction in E1 to formally cut off all of East Jerusalem. Benjamin Netanyahu made a trip to the settlement of Ofra just 2 days ago and declared that he will do everything possible to prevent a Palestinian state. And the settlement is strategically located on the road between Jerusalem and Nablus, East Jerusalem and Nablus, which means it splits the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank in the north from what is supposed to be a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. It also is east of Ramallah, the administrative seat of a future Palestinian state. And so it splits Ramallah off from everything to its east. And it's a bastion of religious nationalist fanaticism that's located south of Shiloh, which is said to be so biblically significant it can never be removed. So the mask is off. Israel will never allow a Palestinian state as long as it is a Jewish state. It's committing genocide to prevent that. The conditions in the West Bank are horrible. And so for anyone to entertain the possibility of a two-state solution or a Palestinian state side by side with an exclusivist settler colonial Jewish state is not only engaging in the most delusional fantasy possible, they're reinforcing the Zionist narrative and playing into the hands of the genocidal project. The problem for them is, if they want to remain respectable, they're afraid to actually call for the dismantlement of the Zionist project. But that is simply the only path to peace. And I think it's very clear right now, and it will become increasingly clear. And what I say right now will become more and more mainstream in the coming years as we watch more horrors unfold on our phones.
What do you think happened, Max, to I remember back in the days, Leonard and I have talked about shuttle diplomacy and back in those days when maybe the world had a little more balance to it. But in those days also there was an Arab counterweight to what Israel is doing all the time. And I remember them calling it the street. Well, the street won't allow us to do X, Y, and Z. We have to be a counterweight to Israel, or else the street will come after us. I'm thinking about countries like Egypt and even Saudi Arabia in those days. How do you account for the silence of the Arab world and even the Muslim world around what's happening now relative to how it used to be even 15 years ago?
Well, a lot of that was thanks to the shuttle diplomacy of Henry Kissinger, isolating Syria's Hafez al-Assad, who was demanding greater autonomy and including Palestinian autonomy. Kissinger essentially began the process of isolating and destroying Syria as an independent Arab state. And that was consolidated with the rise to power of Mohammed al-Jilani, aka Ahmed al-Sharaa. And, who was he? He was the leader of a gigantic al-Qaeda aligned death squad backed by the CIA, MI6, and Gulf states like Qatar and Turkey to destroy Syria as the last independent Arab state. Egypt gave up its independence with the signing of the Camp David Accords. And the Camp David Accords contained a vague promise for Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank, but no borders were set. And of course, the US did nothing to enforce that autonomy. So there's actually a declassified CIA memo. I forget the name of the author of it, who said, it doesn't look like Menachem Begin is going to make good on this plan for Palestinian autonomy. In other words, a Palestinian state. Egypt's economy became linked to Israel's. They rely on Israel. They export gas to Israel. They rely on Israeli imports. They became a neoliberal laboratory for Western exports of cheap goods. Their population is exploding. They're massively in debt. They constantly face bread riots and currency crises, and their military controls 40% of their economy, at least, and the military depends entirely on Western aid. So Egypt was really the voice and the soul of Arab nationalism under Gamal Abdel Nasser, and under his successor, Anwar Sadat, who was assassinated for this titanic sellout to Israel. They became essentially a backwater. Syria is now, it's essentially destroyed as an independent Arab state, and as a state at all. It's now being divided up into various ethnic kind of Bantustans, or balkanized. Its government is fighting to keep it together by terrorizing, the Druze minority in the southwest, by terrorizing the Alawites on the coast. It will move on to the Christians next if they seek any autonomy from the state. And then you have the Kurds in the northeast who are working directly with the US military. So what's left? What's left? Then you have the Gulf states, which have always collaborated with Israel and with the West, which are just colonial carve-outs that were set up by the British Empire. And you have Jordan, set up through Sykes-Picot, the remnants of the Hashemites who were kicked out of Iraq. The king of Jordan is a half British. I think he speaks Arabic with an accent. His eyes are as blue as mine. He's powerless to resist Israel at this point. And so what it leaves is the axis of resistance, which has suffered some setbacks since October 7th, particularly in Lebanon. And the base is in Iran. And it's Shiism and their interpretation of Shiism as a revolutionary force of social justice, their development of a completely independent military, a ballistic missile program that was developed without any help, which is responsible for surviving as the only force currently deterring Israel, a greater Israel, from expanding into all of those other countries. Benjamin Netanyahu said last week that he feels a spiritual connection with Greater Israel. Greater Israel expands into Iraq. Greater Israel expands into the Sinai. And the Sinai was occupied until 1973. And this can happen again. But what I see happening is, I don't think this is permanent. I think Israel is consolidating itself as the regional hegemon. And in doing so, they're going to put so much pressure on Egypt that they could potentially return to conflict with Egypt. And Egypt does have an enormous amount of US military hardware. This is something Israel's concerned with. And I also think in the capitals in the Gulf, not just Doha, but Riyadh, in the United Arab Emirates, they are seeing how extreme Israel is, and that even after Syria essentially surrendered, Israel continues to attack and occupy Syria, that they could be next, even if they ally with Israel formally through the Abraham Accords. They're actually not going to be they can never be an ally or an equal partner with Israel. They're always going to be treated as subservient with a gun to their back. It just has to, this is just a process that's going to have to play out over the next several years. And it's happening much faster than I ever thought it would.
Max, you You've talked about the influence of Zionist billionaires like Bill Ackman and the Adelsons. What about the anti-Zionist billionaires? Aren't they out there? I mean, there's a growing number of anti-Zionist Jews. I think a lot of Jews have sort of had to reflect on their understanding of Zionism. So, is there any counterforce of great wealth that can counter the pernicious influence of some of the Ackmans and the Adelsons?
Yeah, I don't know. Uh, the issue with the Zionist billionaire class is that they are a class. They're advancing their class interests as billionaires, and they're organizing and networking together as Jewish Zionists. And there's nothing like that on the other side because most billionaires, why would they want to support anti-Zionist radicals who support, boycotting major corporations? It goes against their class interest.
Do you think some of it has to do with the the weapons industry and the war industry? And is there some synergy between uh, war profiteering and Zionism?
There for certain billionaires, there is. I mean, they have skin in the game with the weapons industry, but others like Bill Ackman are just investors. They're part of a kind of rentier class that just sit around playing tennis all day while their fortune accumulates, or they are giant landlords like Sheldon Adelson who just owned casinos where money accumulated within the property that he owned, and all he had to do was pay for lots of security to make sure too much didn't go out. It's about class. It's about being the 0.1%, and it's about being secular Jews. Most of the Zionist billionaires are secular Jews. They need Israel in order for them to feel Jewish. And so, if there are any anti-Zionist billionaires, I can tell you I know a handful of very wealthy Jews who are anti-Zionist, and almost all of them, except for one or two, inherited their money from their ultra Zionist families. And so, and they are not organizing together on the basis of being Jewish. In fact, they're not organizing together at all. There's no organization that networks them together. And if we look at the most successful political projects in, they're usually reactionary political projects in American life, the Christian right, for example, or just the new right that came out of Reaganism. What they do is they tightly organize with the donors and the doers almost in secret through organizations like the Council for National Policy. And I actually snuck into a Council for National Policy meeting a few years ago. And they get all the rich ideologues who support their cause in a room with all of the activists and the pundits and the media figures. No one is allowed in from the outside, no media, and then they come up with a plan. I don't see anti-Zionist Jewish groups doing that. There's only one anti-Zionist Jewish group that really has some kind of formal nonprofit affiliation in the US. It's called Jewish Voice for Peace. And a recent review of their budget showed that they had raked in loads of money, millions, after the genocide began after October 7th, and they have spent very little of it aside from giving out salaries to their directors. So I don't even know what kind of impact they're making. But I think there's just a lack of organization, a lack of recognition of who the donors actually are and who the activists are. And there's also the issue of class, that people who are extremely wealthy don't want to give their money away to people who might have socialist objectives.
Can you talk a little bit? You mentioned political organizations and, on the populist side or maybe the Republican side. What's happening in the MAGA movement vis-a-vis Israel? You see Marjorie Taylor Greene, making noises about what's happening in Israel, Tucker Carlson and others. How do you see that playing out, if at all?
Well, there's no MAGA anymore. MAGA was a marketing scam that the Republican Party conceived in order to dupe Rust Belt people who had been screwed over by the outsourcing of the blue collar working class in the 90s and 2000s, Iraq war veterans who were mad about coming back without their legs, and suburban small business owners into believing that Donald Trump was actually an anti-establishment figure who was going to buck the system, drain the swamp, and destroy the deep state. And now that Donald Trump is in for his second term and his opposition was quelled, if not completely solidly defeated and demoralized, we can see what Trump intends to do with less of the kind of resistance he faced in his first term and all the truly phony scandals like Russiagate. And it looks very much like what George W. Bush would have done. And on the foreign stage, what John McCain might have done. I call him Orange McCain. It really feels like the forthcoming of George W. Bush's first term. And therefore, MAGA has exploded. And what you have is a Trump cult of people who support Trump because he is not a liberal. He is not a Democrat. He doesn't want, males with penises to go into women's locker rooms. And he's given RFK this brand to take on the mRNA vaccine funding, and they're going to give the courts over to the Christian right. So then the main issue is they're not going to carry out mass deportations because the economy would collapse. So they're just going to humiliate and abuse as many immigrants as possible that ICE can catch, and deputize the Proud Boys to run around in masks and humiliate Venezuelan door dashers and working class Mexicans in Home Depot parking lots to satisfy a bunch of MAGA chuds so they can go on Twitter through their anonymous accounts and state, I voted for this, every time they see a Mexican get smashed into the ground by an ICE squad. That's all Trumpism is at this point, along with what the US government has been doing throughout my lifetime, which is running our pockets, the US taxpayers, for as much as they can loot, and giving it to the ultra wealthy through various appropriations bills. $150 billion to Elon Musk for the Golden Dome, $100 million to Palantir, giant slush fund for venture capitalists, Trump Incorporated taking in millions and millions. They literally have a super PAC called Trump, I think it's called Trump Incorporated, taking millions to do favors for other millionaires, giving pardons to all of these financial criminals while punishing people for the smallest infractions, throwing a sandwich at a cop, those kinds of things. So then you have this contradiction, though, which is that part of the MAGA brand and the MAGA hustle was America first. There were these two interchangeable slogans. We're going to just make America great, and we're going to put America first. And a few people who actually took that seriously in Congress are now noticing that Trump is putting Israel first. And Trump is openly saying it. He went on Mark Levin's radio show yesterday, Mark Levin being one of the main voices of Netanyahu in the media, and called Benjamin Netanyahu a war hero. He's advancing a kind of two-tiered legal system on behalf of Jewish and Israeli college students and residents of the United States. And it's just so obvious what's going on. He's taking the United States to war against Iran on Israel's behalf. He's attacking Yemen on Israel's behalf. And there are also some figures in America First who happen to be Christians who believe that life is sacred, who are actually kind of pro-life, and they're horrified as we are by these images that keep coming up on their phone of shredded children or groups of orphans in Gaza graduating from their elementary school with their entire family exterminated, all crying at their graduation. This is a video that just appeared this week. Marjorie Taylor Greene is one of them. And they're speaking to a growing base of disgruntled Trump voters who happen to be plugged into social media and extremely online like we are, and are seeing the same things we're seeing, but they can't seem to overcome their cultural resistance to joining with the real Palestine solidarity movement because they see them as a bunch of mask-wearing, blue-haired queers in the street who want communism. So they've had to develop their own language, and they turn to podcasters like Nick Fuentes, who has really kind of claimed the mantle of America First, to find that language. And it is a pretty increasingly, it's a anti-Jewish language. They see that the entire Jewish communal leadership is supporting this genocide, is paying politicians, basically bribing them to support it, and are shutting down all dissent. And so they are exploding the distinction between Judaism and Zionism that we have always tried to delineate. You know, me and Len being Jews who are opposed to Zionism, we should kind of seemingly represent the difference between Judaism and Zionism, just embody that. But that doesn't matter to people who didn't grow up around Jews, may have not grown up in a big city or gone to a private school or gone to a big university, didn't go to bar mitzvahs growing up, and don't know what Jewish life is really like. And they just see what they see on social media. And it's a bunch of genocidal, fire-breathing, maniacal and messianic Jews who are wanting to censor all speech criticizing Israel and funding any politician like Randy Fine who openly seeks the starvation of Gaza. It's absolutely disgusting. So that's what's happening there, and it's going to grow. I don't know where it can go because right now it's primarily an online phenomenon. But just to bring it home, because I know that was a really long response, but for me, it was kind of therapeutic to say it. To bring it all home, there is no more MAGA. There is Trump, the Trump cult, and then there is a grassroots America First group or America First movement that is sort of in the political wilderness right now.
Max, you seem to be um, envisioning that this can't go on, that there's going to be some dismantling of the Jewish state. I mean, it certainly has been a mask off moment for a lot of people, and the way you've described what people are seeing every day, images from Gaza. Um, it seems that Israel's sort of its theory of how it can survive is to just become more and more brutal rather than to try and what maybe liberal Zionists have been calling for is to try to get along with your neighbors, live in peaceful coexistence with your neighbors. Um, I think what you're saying, Max, is that never really was a possibility, and
No,
that what
no Palestinian ever experienced liberal Zionism. It was something. It was just a
right.
fantasy
And
for.
again, I'd love to maybe explore that a little bit more, but because it seems like what Jeffrey Sachs is talking about is not a Zionist state. He's talking about a state of Israel and a state of Palestine living side by side in peace. Now, obviously, what he's talking about would require getting rid of all the settlements. The settlers are going to have to be forcibly kicked out, um, and you know obviously the right of return is going to be an issue, but I think what I've learned from you is this state of Israel cannot be a Jewish state, because once it's a Jewish state, then there's demographic problems. You can't allow a certain number of Palestinians, and that leads to what we've seen as genocide. So I'm just wondering, what do you see as the end game here? How is this going to all play out? Because and now I'm kind of rambling, but you just did a really interesting interview with is it Anthony Aguilar,
Yeah.
and he seems to be saying something too, that this is a mask off moment, that more people are going to be speaking out at this dystopian, um, what is it, the Palestinian humanitarian organization, which is apparently a scam, um,
Yeah.
and so again, a lot of there's so much pressure right now, and it's a moment that seems like we can't go back in time to these fantasies of this benevolent Jewish state. So, what do you see? How is this going to play out? Where are we headed?
Um, yeah, I had a thought there and I lost it. Um, where is this headed? Well, actually one point I wanted to make about a Jewish state. 2 points. American Jews overwhelmingly oppose a white Christian state being established in the United States, and I'm one of them. An increasing number of Americans are organizing on the basis of being white Christians or white Gentiles and moving towards white nationalism. And I think that has fueled the rise of Trump. And that has received harsh condemnation from groups like the Anti-Defamation League. One of the, he's faded into oblivion now, but Richard Spencer, who was one of the leaders of the white nationalist movement during the first Trump term, he felt like kind of an op to me, but he said, I am a white Zionist. I just want for my people what the Jews want for theirs in Israel, Palestine. And so I support Zionism there, and we should have a white Christian Zionism here. This is our Zion. And it was a very clever way of flipping the script on the ADL and essentially on Jewish Americans in general, because most of them still support Zionism, at least older ones. And they should be forced to answer for that. They should be forced to explain to white Christian Americans or white nationalists why they cannot have a white Christian state in the United States ruling over all minorities when they have their Jewish state over there, a second country. And I have to be consistent and oppose both. You cannot be a small d Democrat in the United States and support a Jewish state in any form because it's been imposed on another people who are not Jewish, who have no rights, who have no nationality, so that Rabbi Shmuley, Ben Shapiro, Jared Kushner, and Howard Lutnick can have a fake second state, a second country if they want it. And white Gentiles in America, all Gentiles in America, have to pay for that with their tax money. Most foreign aid goes to that project for that reason. So the hypocrisy there cannot be explained away. The contradiction can't be papered over anymore. Second point is that Israel occupied Palestinians before 1967, and this isn't recognized well enough. Israel imposed a military occupation from 1948 to 1966. And for 6 months between 1966 and 1967, the Israeli military relinquished its occupation of Palestinians who live within what is now 1948 Israel. And that's what many left and liberal Zionists call like the 6 months of democracy or the 6 months of Israel's golden age. But if you read some of the revisionist Israeli historians like Tom Segev, Israel was on the verge of social collapse. Israelis were at each other's throat. They had nothing to unite around. Many Mizrahi Jews from the Arab world were talking about returning to Morocco, returning to Yemen. It was a small state that was uncertain about its own existence. And then 1967 arrived and they got this occupation. They got Greater Israel. It opened up access to all of these religious sites, which gave dynamism to the movement, and religious nationalism started to take hold, and Jews started to visit the spring where Abraham and Sarah supposedly swam in Hebron in the middle of a Palestinian neighborhood and built all these settlements. And Israel started to become an empire. So they must occupy, they must have access to the West Bank, and they must ethnically cleanse Gaza in order to continue to be a Jewish state. Genocide and settler colonialism are part of the DNA of Zionism. And that's why there can be no Jewish state at peace. And so now we have to choose peace or Jewish state. We also have to choose democracy or Jewish state. And that means in our own society, because we are being forced now to withdraw our own First Amendment rights in order to avoid criticizing this Jewish state as our courts, which are being corrupted, and our Department of Justice, and every other government entity is equating anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. So that as long as the Jewish state persists, we are going to lose rights in our own society. So we can't allow this to continue. And I think the majority of people in the world agree with me. It's going one of two places. The first place it can go is the majority of people in the world, the majority of Americans, the majority of Democratic Party voters oppose this project and are more and more are supportive of Palestinians. And to the extent that their voices and cannot be heard in the halls of power, they will be repressed, and we will be living in an increasingly authoritarian society that will do away with the veneer of liberal democracy. We'll be entering a kind of new era of political life in the US and across the West in the supposed liberal democratic Europe, which is moving to the right for many other reasons. Or we will actually see international law enforced, and we will see a massive crisis unfold within Jewish life as the project of Israel is dismantled. And Jews across the West, in particular, will be forced to cope with the fact that they have enjoyed a golden age in these countries, and that they will have to be content with that and be with living in those countries as their only nation. I'm okay with that. I think more and more younger Jews are okay with that. But we have a huge problem, about 6,000 miles away, and we'll discuss that, I guess, in another Unfettered episode.
Well, we'd love to have you back, Max, and really appreciate this discussion. It's a very difficult time, especially for American Jews to sort of process what we're seeing, and we appreciate your help us understand it. So, thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Len and Pat, for the provocative questions. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I really appreciate the time. I know you've got a lot of projects, Max, but where can people find you?
thegrayzone.com. Sign up for our Substack at The Gray Zone. You'll get all of our content in your inbox. We're on all of the social media sites that you know and are suppressed and censored by.
Great. Well, thanks again for your time. We'd love to have you back on another episode. It's always fascinating to talk to you. And don't forget to subscribe and like this episode.
Thanks. And thanks for what you're doing at Integrity.
Thanks.
Thanks, Max.
Talk to you soon.